I never expected to end up behind a serving counter again, spooning mashed potatoes onto plastic trays while young airmen filed past me like I was invisible. The hairnet itched against my scalp and the stained apron hung loose around my civilian clothes, but I kept my head down and did the work. They'd made it clear this was my place now. Kitchen duty, cleanup, the kind of assignments they give to people they want to forget about. But sometimes the past has other plans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. I'd been working the civilian contractor kitchen staff for 3 months now, ever since I'd moved to Anchorage and needed steady work that didn't ask too many questions. The pay was decent, the hours predictable, and most importantly, nobody cared about what I'd done before I started showing up in their industrial kitchen at 0500 every morning. I pulled my beat-up Honda Civic into the employee parking lot as the first hints of dawn painted the Alaskan sky in shades of pink and gold. The air bit at my cheeks with that particular cold that only comes from living this close to the Arctic Circle, and my breath formed small clouds as I walked toward the back entrance of the base dining facility. The building was all function over form, a concrete block structure that had been feeding airmen for decades without caring much about aesthetics. Inside, the kitchen hummed with the familiar sounds of industrial food preparation. Steam rose from massive pots, dishwashers clanked and churned, and the constant sizzle of bacon on griddles created a symphony of organized chaos. The smell of coffee and scrambled eggs mixed with the sharper scents of industrial cleaners, and that particular metallic smell that came from cooking for hundreds of people at once. I tied my apron around my waist and grabbed a hairnet from the dispenser, catching my reflection in the polished surface of a serving counter. At 42, I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be, another middle-aged civilian trying to make ends meet with government contract work. My brown hair, streaked with premature gray, was pulled back in a simple ponytail that would fit easily under the required head covering. No makeup, no jewelry, except for a simple silver chain that disappeared beneath my collar, and clothes chosen for function rather than appearance. The kitchen supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was already directing the morning prep with the efficiency of someone who'd been feeding military personnel for longer than most of them had been alive. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and an accent that spoke of decades in America without losing the cadence of her native Taiwan. She ran her kitchen with military precision despite never having served herself, and she treated all her civilian staff with the same brisk professionalism. "Sarah, you're on serving line today," she called over the noise of prep work, using the name I'd given when I applied for the job. "Breakfast rush starts in 20 minutes. Main entrees and sides." I nodded and took my position behind the steam tables, checking that the serving utensils were clean and the food warmers were at proper temperature. The dining facility would open to a flood of hungry airmen in just a few minutes, and I'd learned that the morning rush was relentless. Young people with fast metabolisms and demanding schedules didn't have patience for slow service or cold food. The first wave came through exactly on schedule. Fresh-faced recruits barely out of basic training, seasoned NCOs grabbing quick meals between duties, and officers who moved with the particular confidence that came from never having to question whether their next meal was guaranteed. They filed past my station with practiced efficiency, pointing at what they wanted, making small talk with each other while treating the serving staff like part of the equipment. "Scrambled eggs, please," said a young airman with corporal stripes still shiny on his sleeve. He couldn't have been more than 19, with the kind of eager enthusiasm that hadn't been worn down by deployments or bureaucracy yet. I spooned eggs onto his plate with practiced efficiency, my movements automatic after months of repetition. "Hash browns?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Young military personnel had predictable appetites. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." He was polite, the way they taught them to be, but his eyes were already looking past me, toward the next station, where bacon and sausage waited. The morning continued in steady rhythm. Serve, smile, move to the next person. Most of the time, I might as well have been invisible, just another piece of the machinery that kept the base functioning. Occasionally, someone would make eye contact and offer a genuine thank you, but mostly I was part of the background, unremarkable and easily forgotten. It was during the mid-morning lull, when the breakfast rush had died down and we were prepping for lunch service, that things started to change. I was refilling the serving trays when I heard a commotion near the entrance to the dining facility. Raised voices. The sound of someone being firmly but politely corrected. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," came a voice I recognized as belonging to Sergeant Martinez, one of the security personnel who managed access to the dining facility. He was a good soldier, professional but not unkind, the type who followed regulations because they mattered, not because he enjoyed having power over people. "I told you, I'm here about the kitchen contractor evaluation," came the response, a woman's voice with the kind of edge that suggested she wasn't used to being questioned. "I don't need to show ID to every enlisted person who decides to play security guard." I looked up from my work, curious about the disturbance. Through the service window, I could see a woman in an expensive business suit, arguing with Sergeant Martinez. She was maybe 50, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of makeup that required significant time and money to maintain. Her briefcase looked like it cost more than I made in a month, and she carried herself with the particular arrogance of someone who believed civilian contractor meant she outranked military personnel. "Ma'am, base security regulations apply to everyone," Martinez replied patiently, "contractor or not. You need proper identification and authorization to be in this facility." The woman's face was reddening with indignation. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Patricia Westfield from Westfield Consulting. We have a multi-million-dollar contract with this base. I'm here to evaluate the efficiency of your food service operations, and I don't appreciate being treated like some kind of security threat by someone who probably makes less than my assistant." I felt my jaw tighten involuntarily. I'd met people like Patricia Westfield before, contractors who swooped in with their clipboards and their recommendations for efficiency improvements that usually meant fewer jobs and lower wages for the people actually doing the work. They spoke about cost savings and optimization, while never considering that their suggestions affected real people trying to make real livings. Martinez maintained his professional demeanor despite the insult. "I understand, ma'am. If you have your authorization papers and valid ID, this will just take a moment to verify." Westfield made a show of digging through her briefcase, muttering about incompetence and bureaucracy. When she finally produced her credentials, Martinez scanned them carefully before stepping aside to make a phone call. Protocol required verification for contractor access, regardless of how expensive someone's suit was or how loudly they complained about it. While Martinez waited for confirmation, Westfield turned her attention to the dining facility itself, pulling out a tablet and making notes with the kind of aggressive efficiency that suggested she'd already decided what her report would say before she'd even arrived. Her gaze swept over the serving area with barely concealed disdain, taking in the utilitarian design and well-used equipment, with the expression of someone calculating how many corners could be cut. "Outdated equipment, overstaffed serving line, excessive portion sizes," she muttered, just loud enough for her voice to carry. "Typical military waste. We could probably cut operating costs by 30% with proper management." Mrs. Chen emerged from the kitchen office, drawn by the commotion. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She dealt with efficiency consultants before, and they never brought good news for the people actually running the operation. "You must be the consultant," Mrs. Chen said politely. "I'm Helen Chen, kitchen supervisor. If you'd like a tour of our facilities, I'd be happy to show you around." Westfield looked Mrs. Chen up and down with barely concealed condescension. "I'll be conducting my own evaluation, thank you. I find that guided tours tend to emphasize certain aspects while glossing over inefficiencies." Martinez finished his phone call and returned with authorization for Westfield's access. "You're cleared to proceed, ma'am. Mrs. Chen will escort you through the facilities." As the group moved into the dining area, I returned to my prep work, trying to focus on the routine tasks that had become comfortingly predictable over the past months. But I could hear Westfield's voice carrying from the dining area, making observations and recommendations that sent cold chills down my spine. "The serving staff appears to be overstaffed for current demand," she was saying, her voice carrying the tone of someone making pronouncements rather than observations. "I count at least 3 positions that could be eliminated during non-peak hours. The cost savings would be significant over a fiscal year." She continued her evaluation with the ruthless efficiency of someone who'd never had to worry about whether eliminating a job meant someone couldn't pay rent or buy groceries for their family. To her, we were line items on a spreadsheet, variables to be optimized rather than people with lives and bills and responsibilities. "The portion control is excessive," she continued. Military personnel are consuming significantly more calories than Department of Defense nutritional guidelines suggest. Reducing portion sizes by 15% would create substantial savings in food costs while potentially improving the health outcomes of base personnel. I gripped the serving spoon tighter than necessary. Portion control meant hungry young airmen who burned calories training and working in challenging conditions. It meant NCOs who might skip meals because they didn't feel full enough to focus on their duties. It meant treating food as an expense to be minimized rather than fuel for people performing demanding jobs. The evaluation continued for another hour, with Westfield making notes and recommendations that would fundamentally change how the dining facility operated. Fewer staff, smaller portions, cheaper ingredients, more automation. Every suggestion was framed in terms of efficiency and cost savings, with no apparent consideration for the impact on either the people working in the kitchen or the airmen, depending on the meals. As the lunch rush began, Westfield positioned herself near the serving line to observe operations during peak demand. She stood with her tablet and her disapproving expression, timing how long each interaction took, and making notes about what she clearly considered inefficiencies in the system. The civilian contractors appeared to be engaging in unnecessary social interaction with military personnel, she observed to Mrs. Chen, loud enough for the serving staff to hear. Food service should be about efficiency, not conversation. These interactions slow down the line and create bottlenecks during peak periods. I felt heat rising in my cheeks. The unnecessary social interaction was basic human courtesy, the kind of small acknowledgments that reminded everyone involved that we were people, not machines. A good morning, or how are you today, took seconds, but created the kind of positive atmosphere that made difficult jobs more bearable for everyone involved. The lunch crowd was typical for midday, a mix of personnel grabbing quick meals between duties, with more senior NCOs and officers who had slightly more flexibility in their schedules. The rhythm was familiar and comfortable. Serve, acknowledge, move to the next person. But now every interaction felt scrutinized, every moment of human connection documented as inefficiency to be eliminated. It was during this rush that Technical Sergeant Riley approached my station. He was a regular, someone I'd served probably 100 times over the past few months. Mid-30s, with the kind of steady competence that spoke of years of experience in logistics. He always ordered the same thing, whatever the daily special was, plus extra vegetables. And he always said thank you with genuine warmth. "Good afternoon, Sarah," he said with his usual friendly smile. "How's the day treating you?" "Can't complain, Sergeant Riley," I replied, serving his usual order without him having to ask. "The chicken looks particularly good today." "You always take good care of us," he said, accepting the plate gratefully. "I don't know how you keep track of everyone's preferences, but it doesn't go unnoticed." It was exactly the kind of interaction Westfield had just criticized as inefficient, but it was also what made the job worthwhile. These small moments of human connection, the recognition that we were all part of the same community trying to take care of each other. Riley moved on toward the beverage station, but his words had warmed something in my chest that had been growing cold under Westfield's calculating gaze. "Excessive personalization of service," Westfield noted on her tablet, watching Riley walk away. "Inefficient use of time and resources. The serving staff should focus on speed and portion control, not memorizing individual preferences." Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was months of keeping my head down and my mouth shut. Maybe it was watching this woman reduce human beings to cost-benefit analyses. Maybe it was the dismissive way she'd spoken to Sergeant Martinez and Mrs. Chen. But suddenly I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying more authority than a cafeteria worker was supposed to have. "But those inefficiencies you're documenting, they're called treating people with respect and dignity. Something you might want to consider adding to your recommendations." The dining facility went quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths, and every eye in the room turned toward the serving line, where a civilian contractor had just challenged a high-paid consultant. Westfield's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that suggested she wasn't used to being contradicted by people she considered beneath her station. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice dropping to the kind of dangerous quiet that preceded explosions. "I don't believe anyone asked for your opinion on my professional evaluation." "You're right," I replied, untying my apron with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Nobody asked for my opinion. Just like nobody asked those airmen if they wanted to be treated like inventory items instead of human beings." Mrs. Chen appeared at my elbow, her face pale with concern. "Sarah, please let me handle this." But it was too late for handling. Something had been building inside me for months, maybe years, and Westfield's casual dismissal of basic human dignity had finally pushed it over the edge. I pulled off my hairnet and set it on the counter with the deliberate precision of someone who'd made a decision and intended to see it through. "Your efficiency recommendations," I continued, looking directly at Westfield, "assume that the primary purpose of this facility is to minimize costs. But you're wrong. The primary purpose is to take care of the people who serve this country, to give them a place where they're treated with respect and fed properly so they can do their jobs effectively." Westfield's mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to breathe air. She wasn't used to resistance from people she considered service workers, and it showed in the way she struggled to formulate a response that maintained her authority while addressing the challenge to her methods. "Security," she finally managed, her voice shrill with indignation. "I want this person removed from the premises immediately. She's clearly mentally unstable and poses a threat to the evaluation process." Sergeant Martinez had been watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to decide whether intervention was necessary. Now he approached the serving line with the measured pace of a professional, dealing with a situation that required careful handling. "Ma'am," he said to me, his voice respectful but firm, "I'm going to need you to step away from the serving area and come with me." I nodded, accepting the inevitable consequences of my decision to speak up. "Of course, Sergeant. I understand." As I moved to follow Martinez, something shifted in the dining facility. The airmen who'd been watching in stunned silence began to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying undertones of support and indignation. They'd witnessed someone stand up for their dignity, and even though I was facing removal, the moment had created something that couldn't be taken back. "Wait a minute," called Technical Sergeant Riley, standing up from where he'd been sitting. "Sarah's right. This consultant has been treating all of us like we're problems to be solved instead of people doing our jobs." Other voices joined in, a growing chorus of support from personnel who'd been reduced to statistics in Westfield's evaluation. The situation was escalating in ways that no one had anticipated, least of all Westfield herself, who was now looking around the room with growing alarm at the unified opposition to her methods. But as Martinez escorted me toward the exit, something caught his attention that made him pause. As I'd removed my apron, my civilian shirt had shifted slightly, revealing just a hint of the silver chain I wore around my neck. Normally it stayed hidden beneath my collar, unremarkable and invisible. But now, with the chain slightly visible, Martinez could see that it wasn't just jewelry. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice changing in a way that suggested he'd noticed something significant. "What's on that chain?" I hesitated. For months, I'd kept my past buried, hidden beneath hairnets and aprons, and the anonymity of contract work. But something in Martinez's tone suggested that keeping secrets might not be an option anymore. With deliberate care, I reached up and pulled the chain out from beneath my shirt. At the end of the silver links was a small metal object that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in sharp reflections. It wasn't jewelry or decoration. It was a pair of pilot's wings, the distinctive silver insignia of someone who'd earned the right to fly military aircraft. But these weren't just any wings. They were the specialized wings of a combat pilot, with additional markings that spoke of missions and qualifications that most people never earned. The dining facility fell completely silent. Every person in the room understood what they were looking at, even if they didn't immediately grasp the full significance. These weren't the wings of a transport pilot or a training instructor. These were the wings of someone who'd flown combat missions, someone who'd been trusted with the most advanced and dangerous aircraft in the Air Force inventory. Martinez stared at the wings for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching awe. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, where did you earn those wings?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that would change everything that came after. Around the room, personnel were beginning to understand that the woman they'd known as Sarah the cafeteria worker might be someone entirely different. someone whose story was just beginning to unfold. Westfield, who'd been preparing to deliver another lecture about disrupting her evaluation, found herself looking at the wings with the growing realization that she might have made a serious miscalculation about who she'd been dealing with. The confident superiority she'd worn like armor was beginning to crack as she recognized that this situation had just become significantly more complicated than a simple personnel problem. "I flew F-22s," I said quietly, my voice carrying across the silent dining facility with the weight of truth. "Stealth missions that officially never happened. Places that don't exist on any map you're cleared to see." The words settled over the room like snow, quiet and transformative. Everything that had happened before this moment suddenly looked different, viewed through the lens of new understanding about who had been serving their meals and listening to their conversations for the past 3 months. And in that moment of revelation, as the dining facility grappled with the reality that their cafeteria worker was a combat pilot whose service record was probably classified at levels most of them would never be cleared to access, the foundation was laid for everything that would follow, the recognition that would come, the questions that would be asked, the truths that would finally, inevitably, surface. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. Martinez stood frozen, his eyes locked on the pilot's wings that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in sharp, accusing angles. The specialized markings on those wings told a story that most people in the room weren't cleared to know, that everyone understood the weight of what they were seeing. Westfield had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her tablet hanging forgotten in her hands as the implications of the situation began to dawn on her. She'd spent the morning treating me like an expendable contractor, someone whose job could be eliminated with a few keystrokes on a cost analysis spreadsheet. Now she was staring at combat pilot wings that represented years of training, millions of dollars in aircraft qualification, and service records that were probably classified above her security clearance. Technical Sergeant Riley had risen from his seat, along with several other NCOs who recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. The younger airmen looked confused but respectful, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't fully understand what. The dining facility had become a frozen tableau, everyone waiting for someone else to break the silence and explain how a decorated combat pilot had ended up serving mashed potatoes in an Air Force cafeteria. "Ma'am," Martinez said finally, his voice carrying a different quality now, the careful respect of someone addressing a superior officer rather than a contract worker. "I think we need to contact the squadron commander immediately." I shook my head slowly, my hand moving instinctively to tuck the wings back beneath my shirt. "That's not necessary, Sergeant. I'm not active duty anymore. I'm exactly what I appear to be, a civilian contractor working in the kitchen." But Martinez wasn't buying it. He'd been in the Air Force long enough to recognize when something didn't add up, and decorated combat pilots didn't usually end up working cafeteria lines unless there was a story worth investigating. His training kicked in, the kind of procedural thinking that made good NCOs valuable to their commands. "With respect, ma'am, those wings suggest otherwise. F-22 pilots don't just disappear into contractor positions without someone asking questions." He turned toward Mrs. Chen, who'd been watching the exchange with growing concern. "Ma'am, I need to use your office phone. This situation requires notification up the chain of command." Mrs. Chen nodded quickly, gesturing toward her small office behind the serving area. She understood bureaucracy well enough to know that when decorated military personnel showed up in unexpected places, it usually meant paperwork and investigations were about to follow. Better to get ahead of the situation than try to explain later why proper notifications weren't made. As Martinez headed for the office, Westfield finally found her voice. "Now wait just a minute," she said, her tone attempting to reclaim the authority she'd wielded so confidently just minutes earlier. "I don't care what kind of wings she's wearing. This person disrupted my evaluation and created a hostile work environment. I want her removed from the premises immediately." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see the airmen around the dining facility exchanging glances that suggested Westfield had seriously misjudged her audience. These were people who understood military service, who respected those who'd put their lives on the line in ways that civilian contractors never would. Her demand to have a decorated pilot removed for defending their dignity wasn't sitting well with anyone. Staff Sergeant Jackson, a maintenance supervisor I'd served lunch to dozens of times over the past months, stood up slowly from his table. He was a big man, with calloused hands, and the kind of steady presence that came from years of keeping aircraft flying under difficult conditions. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned respect through competence rather than position. "Ma'am," he said to Westfield, his tone polite but firm, "I don't think you understand what you're dealing with here. Those wings don't come from a cereal box. They represent service that most of us can only imagine." Other voices joined in. A growing chorus of support from personnel who'd watched Westfield treat their dining facility like a cost center to be optimized, rather than a place that served people doing important work. The woman who'd been memorizing their preferences and making their days slightly better with small acts of courtesy wasn't just a cafeteria worker. She was someone who'd served at levels they were just beginning to comprehend. In Mrs. Chen's office, Martinez was having a conversation that would change everything. He'd called the base operator and asked to be connected to the 90th Fighter Squadron, the F-22 unit based at Elmendorf. When the duty officer answered, Martinez found himself struggling to explain a situation that defied easy categorization. "Sir, this is Sergeant Martinez in base services. I have a situation that requires immediate command attention. We have a civilian contractor here who's displaying F-22 pilot wings and claims to have flown stealth missions. I think someone needs to verify her credentials immediately." The duty officer, Lieutenant Commander Walsh, had been having a quiet morning until this phone call disrupted his routine. "Sergeant, can you be more specific? Are we talking about someone impersonating military personnel?" "No, sir. She's not claiming to be active duty, but she's wearing wings that suggest combat pilot experience, and the situation has escalated beyond my authority to handle." Martinez glanced through the office window at the dining facility, where the standoff between Westfield and the growing group of supportive airmen was becoming more tense by the minute. "Sir, I think this requires officer intervention." Walsh grabbed a pen and started taking notes. "What's her name, Sergeant?" "She's been working here as Sarah Mitchell, but given the circumstances, I'm not sure that's her real name." "Sir, I strongly recommend someone with appropriate clearance level review this situation immediately." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that suggested wheels were turning at levels above a duty officer's pay grade. When Walsh spoke again, his voice had taken on the careful tone of someone handling sensitive information. "Sergeant Martinez, I need you to secure the individual and the area immediately. No one enters or leaves that dining facility until we can get appropriate personnel on scene. This conversation is now classified, and I'm notifying base security and the squadron commander immediately." Martinez felt his stomach drop. When situations became classified that quickly, it usually meant they were dealing with something significantly more complex than a simple identity verification. "Understood, sir. How long until someone arrives?" "Give us 15 minutes. And, Sergeant, treat this with the highest level of discretion. No discussions with anyone not directly involved until cleared by command." The line went dead, leaving Martinez staring at the phone with the growing realization that his quiet morning had just become the kind of incident that generated paperwork and investigations. He returned to the dining facility to find the situation had escalated further in his absence. Westfield was now standing near the exit, her briefcase clutched defensively to her chest, while a semicircle of airmen had formed around my position near the serving line. They weren't threatening or aggressive, but their body language made it clear they considered her the problem, not me. The solidarity was touching and terrifying at the same time. These people barely knew me, but they were willing to stand up for someone they believed had been wronged. "Everyone needs to remain calm," Martinez announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone conveying orders from higher up the chain. "Base security is en route, and until they arrive, no one enters or leaves this facility." Westfield's face went white. "What do you mean no one leaves?" "I have appointments this afternoon. I can't be held here like some kind of prisoner because this woman decided to have a breakdown." "Ma'am, this is no longer about your evaluation," Martinez replied firmly. "This is a security matter that requires investigation by appropriate authorities." I watched the exchange with growing dread. I'd hoped to keep my past buried, to live quietly in the anonymity of contract work, until I figured out what came next. But secrets had a way of surfacing when you least expected them, and now I was watching my carefully constructed new life unravel in real time. The young airman who'd been first in line that morning, Corporal Henderson, approached hesitantly. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what squadron were you with? My dad flew F-16s in the Gulf War, and he always said the F-22 pilots were in a league of their own. The question was innocent, born of genuine curiosity and respect, but it opened doors I'd been trying to keep closed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I looked around the dining facility at faces filled with expectation and growing understanding. People who'd accepted me as Sarah the cafeteria worker, but were now trying to reconcile that image with someone who'd flown the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. I can't discuss operational details, I said carefully, using the kind of neutral language that confirmed everything without revealing anything. Some missions remain classified indefinitely. Henderson nodded respectfully, but his expression suggested he understood more than my words revealed. Around the room, other personnel were beginning to piece together implications that went beyond simple military service. F-22 pilots weren't just fighter jocks. They were among the most highly trained and carefully vetted personnel in the entire Air Force. The fact that one was working in a cafeteria suggested a story that no one was cleared to know. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside broke the tension. Through the windows, I could see Air Force Security Forces vehicles and what appeared to be staff cars from the command section. The cavalry was arriving, bringing with them the kind of official attention I'd been avoiding for the past year. Colonel Sarah Brennan entered the dining facility like she owned it, which in many ways she did. As the 3rd Wing's Director of Operations, she was responsible for every flying mission that launched from Elmendorf. Tall, sharp-eyed, with silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Behind her came Major Thompson from Base Security, and a captain I didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested intelligence or special operations background. "Where is she?" Brennan asked Martinez, her voice cutting through the residual chatter in the dining facility. Martinez pointed toward where I stood behind the serving counter, still wearing my stained kitchen uniform, but now the center of attention from some of the highest-ranking officers on the base. "Ma'am, she's been cooperative throughout this incident." Brennan's eyes locked onto mine across the dining facility, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. Recognition. Not the slow dawning of understanding, but immediate, certain knowledge of who I was and why I was there. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, concern, and something that might have been anger. "Clear the facility," she ordered, her voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't allow for discussion. "All personnel not directly involved in this incident need to leave immediately." The dining facility emptied quickly, airmen filing out with expressions of curiosity and concern. Technical Sergeant Riley caught my eye as he left, offering a small nod of support that I appreciated more than I could express. Within minutes, the large space was reduced to a small group of principals. Brennan and her officers, Martinez, Mrs. Chen, Westfield, and me. "Mrs. Chen," Brennan said politely but firmly, "thank you for your cooperation. This matter is now classified, and I need you to forget everything you've witnessed here today." Mrs. Chen nodded quickly, gathering her paperwork and leaving through the kitchen exit with the alacrity of someone who understood when discretion was the better part of valor. Her departure left an even smaller group to deal with whatever was about to unfold. Brennan turned her attention to Westfield, who'd been standing near the wall clutching her briefcase like a shield. "Ms. Westfield, your evaluation of this facility is terminated immediately. You'll be escorted off base and provided with a new contact for any future consulting needs." "Now wait just a minute," Westfield protested, her voice rising with indignation. "I have a contract with this base. You can't just terminate my evaluation because some cafeteria worker caused a disturbance." The unnamed captain stepped forward, producing a folder from his jacket. "Ms. Westfield, your security clearance has been temporarily suspended pending review. Any materials related to your evaluation are now classified, and discussion of today's events with unauthorized personnel would constitute a violation of federal security regulations." Westfield's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as the implications hit her. Whatever she'd stumbled into was serious enough to trigger security protocols that could end her consulting career if mishandled. Major Thompson gestured toward the exit, making it clear her departure wasn't optional. "But I don't understand," she managed as Thompson escorted her toward the door. "All I did was evaluate kitchen efficiency. How did this become a security matter?" "That's exactly what we intend to find out," Brennan replied coldly, watching Westfield's departure with the expression of someone cleaning up a mess that should never have happened. When we were finally alone, Brennan, her officers, Martinez, and me, the colonel approached the serving counter where I still stood. Up close, her face showed lines that spoke of difficult decisions and sleepless nights, the kind of wear that came from commanding people in dangerous situations. "Captain Alex Morgan," she said quietly, using my real name and rank for the first time in over a year. "Or would you prefer Sarah Mitchell these days?" The use of my actual identity hit like a physical blow. For months, I'd been living as someone else, hiding behind a false name and civilian clothes, trying to build a life that didn't include flight suits and classified missions and the weight of decisions that had cost people their lives. Hearing my real name spoken aloud brought everything flooding back. The responsibility, the pressure, the reasons I'd walked away from everything I'd trained my entire adult life to do. "Just Alex is fine," I said quietly, untying my apron for the second time that day. "I'm not a captain anymore, Colonel." I resigned my commission. Brennan's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Your resignation was never accepted, Alex. It's been sitting on General Morrison's desk for 14 months, while people much smarter than me tried to figure out how to handle the situation. The room felt like it was closing in around me. I'd thought my resignation had been processed, that I was free to disappear into civilian life and try to figure out who I was when I wasn't strapped into the cockpit of a $200 million fighter aircraft. The idea that I was still technically active duty, still bound by the obligations and responsibilities I'd tried to escape, was almost too much to process. "Colonel, with respect, I made my position clear in my resignation letter. I can't continue to fly missions when I've lost confidence in my ability to make the right decisions under pressure." "Because of Operation Nightfall," Brennan said, and the name of the mission that had ended my career hung in the air like an accusation. Operation Nightfall. The words brought back everything I'd been trying to forget: the radio chatter, the split-second decision, the knowledge that I'd saved some lives by sacrificing others. It had been the right call tactically, maybe the only call that made strategic sense, but it had cost me something essential about who I thought I was as an officer and a human being. "Yes," I said simply, because there was nothing else to say. "Because of Nightfall." Major Thompson cleared his throat diplomatically. "Colonel, perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more secure environment." Brennan nodded, but her eyes never left mine. "Captain Morgan, you're coming with us. There are some people who've been waiting a very long time to have a conversation with you." "Am I under arrest?" I asked, though I suspected the answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. "You're a decorated officer whose resignation is under review by people with more stars than I have," Brennan replied. "What happens next depends entirely on what you tell us about why you've been hiding in an Alaskan cafeteria instead of accepting the help the Air Force has been trying to give you." As we walked toward the exit, leaving behind the steam tables and serving spoons that had defined my life for the past few months, I realized that my attempt to disappear had finally caught up with me. The past was pulling me back whether I wanted it to or not, and the decisions I'd made in the cockpit of an F-22 over hostile territory were about to be examined by people who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the weight of impossible choices made in seconds that changed lives forever. The Alaskan afternoon was bright and cold, the kind of weather that reminded you that some places in the world didn't care about human plans and timelines. As we approached the staff cars that would take me back into a world I'd tried to leave behind, I caught sight of some of the airmen I'd served lunch to that morning. They were standing at a respectful distance, but their faces showed concern and curiosity about what would happen next to the woman they'd known as Sarah. Technical Sergeant Riley stepped forward as we passed, his expression serious but supportive. "Ma'am, whatever's going on, you should know that everyone in that dining facility respects what you did today. Standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, that takes real courage." I managed a small smile, touched by the solidarity from people who barely knew me but had been willing to support me when it mattered. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant. And take care of each other." As the staff car pulled away from the dining facility, I watched Elmendorf Air Force Base scroll past the windows and wondered what kind of reckoning was waiting for me. The past year of hiding, of trying to build a life away from the responsibilities and pressures of military command, was ending whether I was ready or not. Whatever came next would have to account for Operation Nightfall, for the decisions I'd made in the heat of combat, and for the question of whether someone who'd lost faith in their own judgment could ever be trusted with the lives of others again. The car turned toward the command section, where conversations waited that I'd been avoiding for over a year. But as we drove through the base I'd come to know as a civilian contractor, I realized that running away had never really been an option. Some responsibilities followed you wherever you went, and some decisions demanded answers that couldn't be avoided forever. The command building at Elmendorf carried the weight of decades of military decisions, its sterile corridors lined with photographs of aircraft and personnel who'd served with distinction in some of the most challenging conditions on Earth. As we walked through those halls, our footsteps echoing off polished linoleum, I felt the familiar mixture of pride and apprehension that came with entering spaces where life and death decisions were made daily. Colonel Brennan led us into a secure conference room that I recognized from my active duty days, a windowless space designed for conversations that couldn't risk being overheard. The walls were lined with maps of the Pacific Theater, communication equipment that looked innocuous but probably cost more than most people's houses, and the kind of furniture that prioritized function over comfort. A large monitor dominated one wall, currently dark but ready to display whatever classified materials this conversation would require. "Have a seat, Alex," Brennan said, gesturing toward a chair at the conference table. Her tone had shifted from the commanding authority she'd used in the dining facility to something more personal, the way senior officers spoke when they were dealing with situations that went beyond standard military protocol. Major Thompson and the unnamed captain took positions near the door, not quite guards, but clearly present to ensure the conversation remained secure. The captain, who I'd now noticed wore no visible name tape or unit insignia, had the bearing of someone from the intelligence community, probably Air Force Office of Special Investigations or something even more specialized. Brennan activated the room's secure communication system with a series of codes that suggested this conversation was being monitored or recorded at levels well above a wing commander's authority. When the equipment finished its electronic handshaking, she turned back to me with an expression that mixed professional concern with something that might have been sympathy. "Alex, before we go any further, you need to understand that Operation Nightfall has been under continuous review since the mission concluded, not because anyone questions your performance, but because the intelligence value of what you accomplished that night has continued to provide strategic advantages that we're still discovering." The words hit me like a physical blow. For over a year, I'd carried the weight of believing that my decision had been a catastrophic mistake, that I'd prioritized some lives over others in a way that violated every principle of military ethics I'd been taught. The idea that the mission was being praised rather than buried was almost impossible to process. "Colonel, with respect, you weren't there. You didn't see what I had to choose between." "You're right, I wasn't there," Brennan replied, settling into the chair across from me. "But I've read the after-action reports, the intelligence assessments, and the classified evaluations from every agency that had assets in that theater. Alex, what you did that night saved more than just the people in that convoy." The monitor on the wall flickered to life, displaying a map of Eastern European airspace that brought back memories I'd been trying to suppress. Red symbols marked enemy positions, blue triangles showed friendly forces, and a complex web of flight paths illustrated the kind of three-dimensional chess game that modern air combat had become. "March 15, 2023, Brennan continued, using a laser pointer to highlight specific locations on the map. "You were flying single-ship reconnaissance over hostile territory when intelligence intercepted communications indicating an imminent attack on a NATO medical convoy. 17 wounded personnel from 3 different countries, including 4 critically injured Americans." I watched the display with growing dread, knowing what came next, but powerless to change the story that was about to unfold. The memories were as sharp as the day they'd happened. The radio chatter, the split-second analysis, the terrible clarity of understanding that there were no good choices, only necessary ones. The convoy was 12 minutes from the extraction point when enemy forces launched a coordinated ambush, Brennan continued. Artillery, small arms, and anti-aircraft systems positioned to create a kill zone that would eliminate everyone in those vehicles. The map updated to show the ambush positions, red circles that formed a deadly perimeter around the convoy's route. I remembered seeing those positions develop in real time, watching helplessly as enemy forces maneuvered into place while the medical vehicles continued toward what would have been certain destruction. At that point, standard protocol called for you to relay intelligence to ground commanders and withdraw to a safe distance while conventional forces mounted a rescue operation. But there wasn't time for conventional forces, was there, Alex? The question hung in the air like an accusation, but Brennan's tone suggested she already knew the answer. I closed my eyes, remembering the desperate calculations that had raced through my mind as I'd watched the situation develop below me. The convoy was too far from friendly forces for rapid response. The enemy had chosen their timing perfectly, creating a window where help couldn't arrive in time to matter. "No," I said quietly. There wasn't time. The convoy would have been destroyed before any rescue could arrive. "So you made a decision that wasn't in your mission parameters," Brennan said, advancing the display to show my flight path during those crucial minutes. "You engaged a numerically superior enemy force with a single aircraft, knowing that your chances of survival were minimal." The red line that traced my F-22's movement through that airspace looked insane in retrospect. A single aircraft diving into combat against overwhelming odds with no backup and no support. But in the moment, it had been the only choice that offered any hope of saving the people in those medical vehicles. "I had stealth advantage and surprise," I said, defending a decision I'd second-guessed 1,000 times. "The enemy wasn't expecting air-to-ground engagement from a reconnaissance mission. You destroyed 3 artillery positions, 2 anti-aircraft sites, and scattered an infantry company with surgical precision," Brennan replied, her voice carrying admiration rather than criticism. "The convoy reached extraction with 0 casualties. But I violated direct orders about mission parameters. I put a $200 million aircraft at risk for an unauthorized engagement. I made tactical decisions that should have been coordinated through proper channels." The words came out in a rush, all the guilt and self-doubt I'd been carrying for over a year finally finding voice. I'd replayed that night countless times, analyzing every decision, questioning whether I'd been a hero or a rogue pilot who'd gotten lucky enough to avoid a court-martial. Brennan leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the kind of attention that suggested she was seeing something I couldn't recognize myself. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that would change everything. "Alex, those weren't direct orders about mission parameters. They were guidelines for normal reconnaissance operations. What you encountered that night fell under combat exception protocols that gave you full authority to engage at your discretion." The room seemed to tilt around me. For 14 months, I'd believed I'd violated orders, that my decision to engage had been an unauthorized deviation from my mission that had somehow worked out despite being wrong. The idea that I'd actually been operating within proper authority was almost too much to process. "Furthermore," Brennan continued, "the intelligence you gathered during that engagement led to the identification and elimination of 3 major enemy command centers. The communications you intercepted while providing close air support revealed strategic information that's still being exploited today." The unnamed captain stepped forward, producing a classified folder that he placed on the table between us. "Captain Morgan, this contains official recognition of your actions during Operation Nightfall, including recommendations for decoration that have been held in classified status pending mission review." I stared at the folder like it might explode. For over a year, I'd been convinced that my service had ended in disgrace, that I'd made decisions that violated everything I'd been taught about military ethics and proper command authority. The possibility that I was being recommended for decoration rather than disciplinary action was almost impossible to believe. "Colonel, I don't understand. If my actions were authorized and effective, why was I allowed to believe otherwise? Why wasn't I debriefed properly? Why did I spend months thinking I'd destroyed my career?" Brennan's expression shifted to something that looked like regret, mixed with institutional embarrassment. "Because the mission was so classified that proper debriefing required security clearances that weren't immediately available. By the time the intelligence assessment was completed and the full impact of your actions was understood, you'd already submitted your resignation and disappeared." "We've been looking for you for 8 months, Major Thompson added. "When you didn't respond to official channels, we started checking veteran employment programs, contractor databases, anything that might indicate where you'd gone. An F-22 pilot with your experience and security clearances doesn't just vanish without people noticing." The weight of understanding settled over me like a heavy blanket. While I'd been hiding in Anchorage, working in a cafeteria and trying to forget who I'd been, the Air Force had been trying to find me to deliver recognition for actions I'd thought were career-ending mistakes. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. "What happens now?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be more complicated than I wanted to hear. Brennan reached across the table and opened the classified folder, revealing documents with official seals and signatures that represented validation I'd never expected to receive. Now you have a choice, Alex. Your resignation can be processed immediately with full honors and recognition for your service, including the decorations you've earned. Or you can withdraw your resignation and return to active duty with a promotion in command position that reflects your demonstrated abilities. The choice was presented matter-of-factly, but I could see the hope in Brennan's eyes that suggested the Air Force very much wanted me to choose the second option. F-22 pilots with combat experience and proven judgment were valuable resources that the service couldn't afford to lose without good reason. Colonel, I need to ask you something and I need an honest answer. I looked directly at her, searching for any hint of the political considerations that often influenced military decisions. Do you really believe I made the right choices that night? Or are you telling me what I need to hear to get me back in a cockpit? Brennan's expression became deadly serious, the kind of look that preceded the most important conversations of a military career. Alex, I've been flying combat missions for 22 years. I've made decisions under fire that cost people their lives, and I've made decisions that saved people who would have died otherwise. What you did that night represents the absolute best of what we train pilots to be. Someone who can assess an impossible situation and take action that saves lives, even when there's no perfect choice available. She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. The people in that convoy went home to their families because you were willing to risk everything to give them that chance. The intelligence you gathered prevented attacks that would have killed dozens more people in subsequent operations. You didn't just perform your duty that night, you exemplified it. The validation I'd been craving without realizing it washed over me like warm water after months of cold. For the first time since Operation Nightfall, I felt like the person I'd trained to be, rather than someone running from decisions I couldn't live with. There's something else, the unnamed captain said, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the conference room. The medical personnel you saved that night included Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma surgeon who since returned to Afghanistan 3 more times and saved an estimated 200 lives using techniques she developed after surviving that ambush. The name meant nothing to me, but the implication was clear. The convoy I'd saved hadn't just been 17 people going home. It had been 17 people who went on to save others, creating a ripple effect of preservation that extended far beyond that single night. Also in that convoy was Sergeant First Class Michael Rodriguez, who used his experience from the ambush to develop new tactical procedures for medical evacuation under fire. Those procedures are now standard training for special operations medics worldwide. Each name, each story added weight to the understanding that my decision that night had consequences I'd never imagined. While I'd been questioning whether I'd made the right choice, the people I'd saved had been using their survival to help others in ways that multiplied the impact of those few minutes of combat. Captain Morgan, Brennan said formally, the Air Force needs pilots who can make the kinds of decisions you made that night. Not just the tactical skill, but the moral courage to act when action is required, regardless of personal cost. I looked around the conference room at faces that showed respect, hope, and something that might have been pride. These weren't people trying to manipulate me back into service. They were professionals who understood the value of what I'd accomplished and wanted to ensure that capability wasn't lost to bureaucratic confusion and personal doubt. If I returned to active duty, what would my assignment be? Brennan smiled for the first time since we'd entered the room. Squadron Commander, 90th Fighter Squadron. The unit you'd be leading includes some of the same pilots who provide air support for the kind of medical evacuation missions you saved that night. They need someone who understands that flying isn't just about technical skill, it's about using that skill to protect people who can't protect themselves. The offer was more than I'd ever expected to be given again. Squadron Command represented trust at the highest levels, responsibility for pilots and aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the authority to make decisions that would affect countless lives. It was also exactly what I'd trained my entire career to do. Colonel, I need some time to think about this. Of course, but Alex, there's one more thing you should know. Brennan gestured toward the monitor, which now displayed a photograph of the dining facility where this day had started. The airmen you served lunch to this morning, the ones who stood up for you when that consultant questioned your dignity, they deserved to know who was taking care of them. The image of Technical Sergeant Riley and the others who'd supported me during the confrontation with Westfield brought unexpected emotion. These people had judged me by my actions rather than my credentials, had shown loyalty to someone they knew only as a cafeteria worker who'd treated them with respect and kindness. They already know who you are, Brennan continued. Not your rank or your decorations, but the qualities that made you effective as a pilot and as a person. The courage to stand up for what's right. The willingness to put others before yourself. The strength to do difficult things when they need to be done. As we left the conference room, my head spinning with information and possibilities I'd never expected to have again, I realized that my year of hiding had taught me something valuable about who I was when I wasn't wearing a uniform or sitting in a cockpit. The person who'd served meals and memorized preferences and stood up to an arrogant consultant was the same person who'd risked everything to save a medical convoy, just operating in a different context. The ride back to the dining facility gave me time to process everything that had happened. My resignation, which I thought was my final act as an Air Force officer, had never been accepted. Operation Nightfall, which I believed was a career-ending mistake, was being recognized as exemplary service. The people I'd saved had gone on to save others, creating a legacy of preservation that extended far beyond anything I'd imagined. When we arrived at the dining facility, I was surprised to see several dozen airmen gathered outside despite the cold afternoon air. Word had apparently spread about the morning's events, and people were waiting to see what would happen to the woman they'd known as Sarah Mitchell. Technical Sergeant Riley stepped forward as I emerged from the staff car, his expression serious but supportive. "Ma'am, we heard there might be some kind of misunderstanding about your status. Whatever's going on, we want you to know that everyone here respects what you did today." Other voices joined in, a chorus of support from people who judged me by my character rather than my credentials. Their solidarity was humbling and inspiring, a reminder that respect was earned through actions rather than decorations. Colonel Brennan addressed the gathered personnel with the authority of someone making an official announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Captain Alex Morgan, F-22 pilot and recipient of multiple decorations for combat service. She's been working among you for the past several months while on extended leave, and today she reminded all of us what true leadership looks like." The revelation sent ripples of amazement through the crowd. The woman who'd been serving their meals, who'd remembered their preferences and treated them with consistent kindness, was a decorated combat pilot whose service record was apparently classified at levels most of them would never be cleared to access. "Captain Morgan," Brennan continued, "has been offered command of the 90th Fighter Squadron. Whether she accepts that position or returns to civilian life, I want all of you to remember what you witnessed today. Real leadership isn't about rank or position. It's about having the courage to do what's right when doing right requires personal sacrifice." As the crowd began to disperse, discussing the morning's revelations in voices filled with wonder and respect, Technical Sergeant Riley approached me one final time. "Ma'am, whatever you decide about returning to active duty, you should know that you've already shown us what kind of officer the Air Force needs. Thank you for standing up for people who needed someone to stand up for them." I shook his hand, grateful for the support, and humbled by the realization that my attempt to hide from responsibility had actually taught me something important about leadership. The best commanders weren't the ones who demanded respect through authority. They were the ones who earned it through service, who used their position to protect and support the people under their care. 2 weeks later, I walked into the 90th Fighter Squadron, wearing the uniform I'd thought I'd never put on again, ready to take command of pilots who would look to me for the kind of leadership I'd finally learned to recognize in myself. The woman who'd served mashed potatoes and stood up to bureaucratic bullying was the same person who'd risked everything to save a medical convoy. And both versions of that story were part of who I was meant to be. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the places we least expect to find them, and sometimes the courage to do extraordinary things starts with the simple decision to treat ordinary people with dignity and respect. In a cafeteria in Alaska, among people who knew nothing of my past or my decorations, I'd rediscovered what it meant to serve others. And in doing so, I'd found my way back to serving my country. The squadron commander's office felt foreign, despite the familiar military furniture and regulation wall hangings. Behind the heavy wooden desk that had served 3 previous commanders, I stared at personnel files that represented more than just names and service records. These were pilots whose lives would be shaped by every decision I made in this chair. The responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying, magnified by the knowledge that my own path back to this moment had been anything but conventional. Major Kevin Santos knocked on the doorframe before entering, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been wondering when this conversation would happen. As my new executive officer, he'd inherited the job of managing a commander who'd spent the last year serving hash browns instead of leading combat missions. The awkwardness was mutual and undeniable. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with practiced military courtesy. "I've prepared the weekly briefing materials you requested, and the squadron's senior staff is ready to meet whenever you are." Santos was a solid officer with 15 years of experience and the kind of steady competence that made good organizations function smoothly. His file showed deployments to 3 combat theaters, commendations for both flying and leadership, and the respect of pilots who'd served under him during my absence. The fact that he'd been passed over for squadron command in favor of someone who'd been hiding in a cafeteria had to sting, even if he was too professional to show it. "Kevin, before we talk about official business, I need to address the elephant in the room," I said, closing the personnel files and meeting his eyes directly. "You've been effectively running this squadron for 8 months while I was learning how to operate industrial dishwashers. You have every right to wonder whether I'm qualified to walk back in here and take command." His expression shifted slightly, surprise replacing the careful neutrality he'd been maintaining. Most commanders didn't begin their tenure by acknowledging their potential shortcomings, especially not with their second-in-command. But my time in the cafeteria had taught me that honest communication was more valuable than maintaining artificial authority. "Ma'am, with respect, that's not my call to make," he replied diplomatically. "Command authority comes from above my pay grade. My job is to support whatever decisions you make and ensure this squadron operates effectively." "That's exactly the kind of answer I expected from your file," I said, offering a small smile. "Professional, correct, and completely unhelpful for what I actually need to know." Santos blinked, clearly unsure how to respond to a commander who seemed to be operating outside normal protocol. The uncertainty on his face reminded me of the young airmen who tried to figure out why a cafeteria worker was giving them advice about their careers. "What I need to know," I continued, "is whether you trust me to make good decisions for the people in this squadron. Not because regulations require you to follow orders, but because you believe I'll put their welfare ahead of my own career advancement." The question hung between us like a challenge, one that required him to move beyond professional courtesy into honest assessment. For a moment, I saw him wrestling with how much truth was appropriate in this conversation, weighing the risk of candor against the safety of diplomatic responses. "Ma'am, I've read your classified service record," he said finally. "What you did during Operation Nightfall suggests you're exactly the kind of commander who puts mission accomplishment and troop welfare ahead of personal considerations. But I'll be honest, disappearing for a year without explanation raises questions about judgment and reliability. The assessment was fair and professionally delivered, exactly what I'd hoped for from an executive officer worth keeping." Santos had managed to express legitimate concerns while avoiding insubordination, walking the fine line between honesty and respect that good military relationships required. "Those are valid concerns," I acknowledged. "Let me ask you this. If you'd been in my position after Nightfall, believing you'd violated orders and endangered people through poor judgment, what would you have done?" Santos considered the question seriously, his expression suggesting he was trying to imagine carrying that kind of doubt and responsibility. "I'd like to think I would have worked through proper channels to get clarification and support. But honestly, ma'am, I don't know what it's like to carry that kind of weight alone." "The key word there is alone," I said. "One of the things I learned while I was away is that isolation makes everything worse. Good decisions require good information, and good information comes from people who feel free to share what they really think." I stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where F-22s Saturday in precise rows like sleeping predators waiting to be awakened. Each aircraft represented capability that could change the outcome of conflicts, but they were only as effective as the pilots who flew them and the commanders who deployed them wisely. "Kevin, I want to establish some ground rules for how this squadron operates," I said, turning back to face him. "First, I want honest assessments from all senior staff, even when those assessments challenge my decisions. Second, we're going to make pilot welfare and professional development our top priorities, because effective people accomplish missions better than stressed and overworked people." Santos nodded, taking notes on a small pad he'd produced from his pocket. "Understood, ma'am." "Anything else?" "Yes, we're going to remember that everyone in this squadron, pilots, maintenance crews, administrative staff, is a person with a life outside this building. We're going to treat them with the respect they deserve, and we're going to create an environment where people feel valued for their contributions rather than afraid of making mistakes. The executive officer's pen paused above his notepad. Ma'am, that sounds like lessons learned from personal experience rather than standard command philosophy. It is, I replied without hesitation. For the past year, I've been on the receiving end of both respect and dismissal, often from people who made judgments based on assumptions rather than actual knowledge. It's given me perspective on what leadership looks like from the bottom up. Over the following weeks, I set about implementing changes that reflected what I'd learned during my time away from command. The squadron's morning briefings became genuine discussions rather than one-way information dumps, with pilots encouraged to share concerns and suggestions without fear of retribution. Maintenance meetings included recognition for innovations and problem-solving rather than just schedule updates and parts shortages. The most significant change was in how we handled mistakes and setbacks. Instead of focusing on blame and punishment, we established a culture of learning and improvement that encouraged people to report problems early rather than hide them until they became crises. The approach was based on something I'd observed in the cafeteria. When people felt safe to admit when they needed help, they got better support and made fewer serious errors. Lieutenant Rebecca Foster was the first pilot to test this new approach. During a routine training mission, she'd made a navigation error that had taken her aircraft outside authorized airspace for several minutes before she'd recognized and corrected the mistake. Under traditional squadron management, such an error would have triggered formal disciplinary action and extensive retraining that would have delayed her certification for months. Instead, I called her into my office for a conversation that focused on understanding what had happened and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Foster entered the office with the expression of someone expecting the worst, her shoulders tense and her responses carefully measured to minimize apparent responsibility. "Lieutenant, walk me through what happened during yesterday's navigation exercise," I said, gesturing for her to take a seat in the informal seating area rather than the formal chair facing my desk. "Ma'am, I made a significant error in waypoint calculation that resulted in unauthorized airspace penetration," she replied with the kind of precise language that suggested she'd been rehearsing this conversation. "I take full responsibility for the mistake and accept whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate." The response was textbook military accountability, professionally delivered and completely useless for understanding what had actually gone wrong. It was the kind of defensive posture that people adopted when they expected punishment rather than problem-solving. "Rebecca, I'm not interested in disciplinary action," I said, using her first name to signal that this was a learning conversation rather than formal correction. "I'm interested in understanding how an experienced pilot with excellent training records made a basic navigation error, and what we can do to prevent it from happening to you or anyone else." Her expression shifted from defensive resignation to genuine surprise. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. I violated airspace restrictions during a training mission. That's a serious safety and security violation." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "And now I need to understand why it happened so we can prevent it from happening again. Were you distracted? Was there equipment malfunction? Did you receive conflicting information? Help me understand the sequence of events." Over the next 30 minutes, Foster walked me through the entire mission, from pre-flight planning to post-flight analysis. What emerged was a picture of small systemic issues that had combined to create the conditions for error: outdated charts, conflicting briefing information, and a training schedule that had left her rushing through critical preparation steps. The navigation system showed waypoint data that was accurate, but formatted differently than what I'd trained with, she explained, her initial defensiveness giving way to analytical thinking. "I thought I'd compensated for the difference, but I must have made a calculation error that compounded over the flight duration." "Have other pilots mentioned similar confusion with the updated navigation displays?" I asked, making notes that would lead to squadron-wide training updates. "Yes, ma'am. Several people have commented on the formatting changes, but everyone assumed they'd adapt quickly enough that it wouldn't be a problem." The conversation revealed that Foster's error was actually symptomatic of broader issues that needed attention at the squadron level. Instead of punishing one pilot for making a mistake, we could address systemic problems that were creating unnecessary risk for everyone. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, closing my notebook and meeting her eyes directly. "You're going to work with our training officer to develop a briefing on navigation system updates for the entire squadron. We're going to update our chart inventory and modify our briefing procedures to address the inconsistencies you identified. And you're going to continue with your certification schedule because one navigation error doesn't negate months of excellent performance." Foster's relief was visible and immediate. "Thank you, ma'am. I was expecting this to end my advancement opportunities. Rebecca, mistakes are how we learn. What matters isn't whether you make errors, it's whether you learn from them and help others avoid similar problems. Your willingness to analyze what went wrong and share those lessons with others makes you more valuable, not less. The approach proved effective beyond my expectations. Within a month, the squadron's incident reporting increased by 40%, but actual safety violations decreased by nearly the same amount. Pilots were identifying and addressing problems before they became serious issues, and the collaborative atmosphere was producing innovations and improvements that formal oversight had never achieved. The changes didn't go unnoticed by higher command. During my first monthly briefing with Colonel Brennan, she commented on performance metrics that suggested the 90th Fighter Squadron was exceeding standards across multiple categories. "Alex, your pilots are showing improvement in everything from mission readiness to maintenance efficiency," she said, reviewing charts that tracked squadron performance against base-wide averages. "Whatever you're doing differently seems to be working." "I'm treating them like people instead of resources," I replied. Turns out that when people feel respected and supported, they perform better and take more ownership of their responsibilities. Brennan set down the performance reports and studied my face with the kind of attention that suggested she was seeing something unexpected. That sounds like lessons learned from outside traditional military leadership training. It is. For the past year, I've been on the receiving end of both good and bad management in civilian environments. The best supervisors were the ones who treated their people with dignity and focused on helping them succeed. The worst ones were focused on maintaining authority and minimizing costs. The conversation reminded me of Patricia Westfield and her efficiency consulting, the way she'd reduced human beings to line items on a spreadsheet while completely missing the value of treating people well. The contrast between her approach and what I'd learned from people like Mrs. Chen and Technical Sergeant Riley couldn't have been more stark. "There's something else," Brennan continued. "Base Services has received multiple commendations from personnel who worked with you during your time in the dining facility. Apparently, your impact there extended beyond just serving meals." The comment brought back memories of young airmen who'd asked for career advice while I'd spooned vegetables onto their plates, of NCOs who'd shared family problems while grabbing quick lunches between duties. Those conversations had felt natural and unimportant at the time, but apparently they'd mattered more than I'd realized. "People need someone to listen to them," I said. "When you're dealing with stress and uncertainty, having someone show genuine interest in your welfare makes a significant difference. That's true whether you're wearing a uniform or civilian clothes." 3 months into my command tenure, the squadron faced its first real test. Intelligence reports indicated potential hostile activity in international airspace that required immediate reconnaissance and possible intervention. The mission parameters were similar to many I'd flown before, but this time I'd be sending other pilots into situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, the mission commander, briefed me on the tactical situation with the kind of precise professionalism that reminded me why I'd missed military operations. "Ma'am, we're looking at a 2-ship reconnaissance mission with possible escalation to defensive engagement if hostile forces interfere with international shipping lanes." The mission profile was complex but well within our capabilities, requiring exactly the kind of judgment and skill that made F-22 pilots valuable strategic assets. But as I reviewed the details, I found myself thinking not just about tactical considerations but about the people who would be executing those tactics. "Who are you recommending for the mission?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Captain Jennifer Walsh and Major Tom Richardson," Davis replied. "Both have extensive experience with this type of operation, and their performance records suggest they can handle whatever complications might arise." I knew both pilots well from their files and from personal observation during training exercises. Walsh was aggressive and skilled, with the kind of competitive drive that made her effective in challenging situations. Richardson was more methodical, a technical expert who never missed details and rarely made errors under pressure. Together, they formed the kind of complementary team that could adapt to changing conditions and make good decisions independently. "What's your assessment of mission risk?" I asked, though military operations always carried risks that couldn't be completely eliminated. "Moderate to high, depending on hostile response," Davis answered honestly. "If it remains reconnaissance only, risk is minimal. If defensive engagement becomes necessary, we could be looking at sustained air-to-air combat with numerical disadvantage." The assessment was sobering but not unexpected. Modern air combat often involved scenarios where small numbers of advanced aircraft faced larger formations of less sophisticated opponents, requiring superior technology and training to overcome numerical disadvantages. Brief the pilots on mission parameters and get me detailed weather and intelligence updates every 30 minutes until launch, I ordered. And Colonel, make sure both pilots understand that mission accomplishment includes bringing everyone home safely. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. As the squadron prepared for what could become our first combat mission under my command, I reflected on how my perspective on leadership had evolved during my time away. The person who'd flown Operation Nightfall had been focused primarily on tactical success, on accomplishing the mission regardless of personal cost. The person who'd served meals and listened to people's problems understood that success meant taking care of everyone involved, not just achieving military objectives. The mission launched on schedule, 2 F-22s disappearing into Alaska's vast airspace carrying pilots whose lives were now my responsibility. As I monitored communications from the command center, surrounded by personnel whose competence and dedication had impressed me daily since taking command, I realized that everything I'd learned during my year away had prepared me for exactly this moment. Leadership wasn't about making perfect decisions under pressure. It was about creating conditions where good people could do their best work and support each other when challenges arose. Whether that happened in a cafeteria serving line or a fighter squadron command center, the principles remained the same. Treat people with respect, listen to their concerns, and never forget that behind every position and every mission were human beings trying to do their jobs well while taking care of each other. The radio crackled with updates from the reconnaissance mission, professional voices reporting positions and observations with the calm competence that made complex operations possible. Whatever happened next, I knew the pilots executing this mission had been prepared not just with technical training, but with the understanding that they were valued members of a team that would support them regardless of the challenges they faced. The radio transmission came through with crystalline clarity at 0347 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of the command center like a blade through silk. Control, this is Falcon 1. We have visual confirmation of hostile surface vessels conducting aggressive maneuvers against civilian merchant traffic. Request permission to move to intercept position. Captain Walsh's voice carried the controlled tension of a pilot who'd found exactly what intelligence had suggested she might encounter, but hoped she wouldn't. Behind me, the command center hummed with quiet efficiency as radar operators tracked friendly and unknown contacts across hundreds of miles of international airspace, while communication specialists maintained secure links with higher command authorities. Falcon 1, control, I responded, my voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through my system. Move to intercept position but maintain defensive posture only. Do not engage unless fired upon or civilian vessels are in immediate danger. Copy. Control. Moving to intercept. Falcon 2 is maintaining overwatch position. Major Richardson's aircraft would stay high and distant, providing sensor coverage and backup support while Walsh moved closer to assess the situation directly. It was exactly the kind of tactical coordination that made two ship formations effective, allowing one aircraft to gather detailed intelligence while the other maintained broader situational awareness. I studied the tactical display showing the developing situation, red symbols representing hostile contacts moving in patterns that suggested coordination and aggressive intent. The civilian merchant vessel appeared as a blue triangle, maintaining steady course and speed while surrounded by contacts whose intentions were clearly threatening. "Ma'am," called Master Sergeant Torres from the communication station, "we're receiving distress signals from the merchant vessel. They're reporting harassment and intimidation from military vessels operating in international waters." The situation was escalating exactly as intelligence had predicted, with hostile forces testing international resolve by threatening civilian shipping in waters where they had no legitimate authority. It was the kind of provocation designed to gauge response times and commitment levels, but with real people caught in the middle of the political chess game. "Falcon 1. Control," I transmitted. "Be advised, civilian vessel is reporting harassment and intimidation. You are authorized to make your presence known and monitor the situation closely." "Copy that, Control." Moving to visual range now. Through the command center speakers, we could hear the subtle changes in engine sound and electronic interference that indicated Walsh was maneuvering her F-22 into position. The stealth characteristics that made the aircraft nearly invisible to enemy radar also created unique acoustic signatures that experienced pilots learned to interpret like a second language. "Control, Falcon 1," came Walsh's voice 30 seconds later, now carrying a different quality that suggested she'd seen something significant. "I have eyes on 6 surface vessels conducting aggressive maneuvers around one civilian merchant ship. The hostile vessels are armed patrol boats, operating in formation. Definitely military rather than civilian interdiction." The confirmation transformed the situation from potential harassment to actual military confrontation. Armed patrol boats operating in formation against civilian shipping represented exactly the kind of escalation that required immediate response to prevent further aggression. "Falcon 1, are the hostile vessels taking any action that threatens the civilian ship directly?" I asked, needing precise intelligence about threat levels before authorizing any escalation. "Control, the patrol boats are conducting close passes and appear to be attempting to force the merchant vessel to change course. I can see deck crews on the civilian ship taking defensive positions, suggesting they feel threatened by the hostile maneuvers." Lieutenant Colonel Davis moved to the intelligence station where real-time data was being processed and correlated with existing threat assessments. "Ma'am, this matches the pattern we've been seeing in 3 other incidents this month. They're testing our response protocols and commitment to protecting international shipping." The strategic implications were clear. Allowing hostile forces to intimidate civilian shipping without response would encourage further aggression, potentially leading to actual attacks on merchant vessels and serious disruption of international commerce. But responding too aggressively could escalate the situation beyond what the tactical situation warranted. "Falcon 2, control," I transmitted to Richardson's aircraft. "What's your assessment of the broader tactical situation?" "Control, Falcon 2. I'm showing clear airspace for 50 miles in all directions, except for the surface contacts already identified. No additional aircraft or surface vessels detected. Weather is clear with excellent visibility." The assessment suggested that whatever happened next would be contained to the immediate area, without the risk of drawing in additional hostile forces or creating broader confrontation. It was exactly the kind of tactical clarity that allowed commanders to make decisions with confidence about potential consequences. "Falcon 1, you are authorized to make yourself visible to the hostile vessels and demonstrate presence," I ordered, knowing that the sight of an F-22 would likely change the dynamic of the situation immediately. "Maintain defensive posture but make it clear that you're monitoring their activities." "Copy, control." Making myself known now. What happened next was exactly what air power theory predicted but was always impressive to witness in practice. The moment Walsh's F-22 became visible to the patrol boats, their aggressive maneuvering stopped immediately. 6 armed vessels that had been harassing a civilian merchant ship suddenly found themselves under observation by one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, and their behavior changed accordingly. "Control, Falcon 1. The hostile vessels have ceased close approach maneuvers and are moving away from the merchant ship. The civilian vessel appears to be resuming normal course and speed." The de-escalation was swift and complete, demonstrating the deterrent value of credible air power when properly applied. Without firing a shot or making any threatening gestures, Walsh had transformed a developing crisis into a manageable situation simply by making her presence known to potential aggressors. "Outstanding work, Falcon 1, I transmitted, feeling the tension in the command center ease as the immediate crisis passed. "Continue monitoring until the civilian vessel reaches safe distance, then return to base." "Copy, control." "Falcon 2, form up for return flight." As the 2 F-22s began their journey back to Elmendorf, I reflected on how the mission had unfolded. The tactical execution had been flawless, with both pilots demonstrating exactly the kind of judgment and professionalism that made complex operations successful. But more importantly, the outcome had protected civilian lives while avoiding unnecessary escalation, achieving strategic objectives through presence and competence rather than violence. The command center began returning to normal operations as the immediate crisis passed, but the mission's success created opportunities for important conversations about leadership and decision-making under pressure. As dawn broke over Alaska, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of mornings in the cafeteria, I realized that everything I'd learned during my time away had influenced how I'd handled this situation. 2 hours later, Walsh and Richardson sat in my office for the post-mission debrief, both still carrying the energy that came from successful completion of challenging operations. Their performance had been exemplary, But the conversation I wanted to have went beyond tactical assessment to understanding how leadership decisions affected the people executing those decisions. Before we talk about mission specifics, I began, I want you both to know that your professionalism and judgment out there were exactly what this squadron should represent. You handled a complex situation with the kind of skill that makes me proud to be your commander. Walsh smiled, the tension of operational stress finally beginning to ease. Thank you, ma'am. It felt good to know that command had confidence in our ability to make the right decisions independently. That confidence isn't given lightly, I replied. It's based on months of observing how you both handle routine operations, how you treat your fellow pilots, and how you approach problems that don't have obvious solutions. Richardson leaned forward slightly, his expression suggesting he understood that this conversation was about more than just tactical performance. Ma'am, can I ask you something about command decision-making? When you authorized us to make ourselves visible to the hostile vessels, were you concerned about potential escalation? The question was perceptive and professional, exactly the kind of thinking that separated good pilots from exceptional ones. I was concerned about several things, I answered honestly. Escalation was one of them. But I was equally concerned about the message we'd send if we allowed civilian shipping to be intimidated without response. So you balanced immediate tactical risks against broader strategic implications? Walsh asked. That's part of it, I said, but I also considered something else that's harder to quantify, the human element. There were real people on that merchant vessel who were genuinely frightened and looking for help. Sometimes the right tactical decision is also the right human decision. The comment opened a discussion about leadership philosophy that continued for the next hour, covering everything from tactical decision-making to personnel management to the relationship between military objectives and human welfare. Both pilots contributed insights that showed they understood that effective leadership required more than just technical competence. Ma'am, Richardson said as our conversation was winding down, can I ask what changed your approach to command? The way you've been running this squadron feels different from what I experienced under previous commanders. The question was inevitable, and I'd been preparing for it since taking command 3 months earlier. I spent the past year learning what leadership looks like from the bottom up, I said carefully. Working alongside people who were judged by their daily performance rather than their credentials taught me that respect has to be earned through actions, not demanded through authority. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Some of the best officers I've served under were the ones who seemed to genuinely care about the people they were leading, not just the missions they were executing. Exactly, I replied. Good people will accomplish almost any mission you give them if they trust that you're making decisions with their welfare in mind, not just your own career advancement. Over the following weeks, word of the successful mission spread throughout the base, carried by the informal communication networks that every military installation maintained. The 90th Fighter Squadron had handled a complex international incident with exactly the kind of professionalism and restraint that higher command valued, and the pilots involved had demonstrated the quality of training and leadership that made such success possible. More importantly, the mission's success validated the changes I'd implemented in squadron culture and operations. The emphasis on honest communication, collaborative problem-solving, and treating people with dignity had created an environment where pilots felt confident making independent decisions and taking initiative when situations required it. Colonel Brennan called me to her office 2 weeks after the mission to discuss performance evaluations and future assignments. Her expression suggested she had news that would affect my long-term career prospects, but her demeanor indicated it was positive rather than concerning. Alex, I've received some interesting communications from Washington regarding your squadron's recent performance, she began, gesturing for me to take a seat in the informal area of her office. It seems that your handling of the merchant vessel incident has attracted attention at levels that normally don't notice individual squadron operations. The comment was both gratifying and slightly concerning. Attention from Washington could mean recognition and advancement opportunities, but it could also mean increased scrutiny and expectations that were difficult to meet consistently. Colonel, I hope the attention is for the right reasons, I said carefully. It is, Brennan replied with a smile. The Secretary of the Air Force has specifically commended your squadron's performance, and there's discussion about using your operational approach as a model for other units. The idea that methods I'd developed based on serving meals and listening to people's problems might become Air Force-wide policy was both humbling and slightly surreal. Ma'am, I'm not sure my approach is revolutionary enough to warrant that kind of attention. Maybe not, Brennan agreed. but it's producing results that are hard to argue with. Your squadron has the highest readiness rates on the base, the lowest incident reports, and pilot satisfaction scores that are off the charts. Whatever you're doing differently is working. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from potential promotion opportunities to requests for me to speak at leadership conferences about management philosophy. Throughout the discussion, I found myself thinking about the people who'd shaped my understanding of effective leadership. Mrs. Work, Chin with her quiet competence, Technical Sergeant Riley with his genuine concern for others, even Patricia Westfield, whose negative example had taught me what not to do. "There's one more thing," Brennan said as our meeting was concluding. "Base Services has received authorization to establish a new program for transitioning military personnel into civilian careers. They've requested that you serve as an advisor, given your unique perspective on both sides of that transition." The request was unexpected but made perfect sense. My experience hiding in civilian employment had taught me things about that transition that most military personnel never learned until they were struggling with it themselves. The opportunity to help others navigate that challenge more successfully was appealing and important. "I'd be honored to help with that program," I said. Transitioning out of military service is more challenging than most people realize, and anything we can do to make it easier seems worthwhile. 6 months later, I stood in the same dining facility where my journey back to command had begun, but now I was there in my Air Force uniform, addressing a group of transitioning personnel about career opportunities and life after military service. The irony of the location wasn't lost on anyone present, least of all me. "The most important thing to remember about leaving military service," I told the assembled group, "is that your value as a person doesn't depend on your rank or your job title. The qualities that made you effective in uniform, integrity, dedication, willingness to serve others, are exactly what civilian employers and communities need." In the audience, I could see faces that reflected the uncertainty and apprehension I'd felt during my own transition. These were people who'd defined themselves through military service and were struggling to imagine who they might become in civilian careers. Their questions were thoughtful and genuine, covering everything from resume writing to managing the psychological adjustment of leaving structured military life. "Ma'am," asked a young sergeant who was preparing to separate after 8 years of service, "how do you maintain the sense of purpose and mission that military service provides when you're working in civilian jobs that might not feel as meaningful?" The question struck to the heart of what many transitioning service members struggled with: finding civilian work that provided the same sense of contributing to something larger than themselves that military service had always offered. "You create meaning through how you approach whatever work you're doing," I replied. "I spent a year serving meals in this facility, and I found purpose in taking care of people who were serving our country. The job title doesn't determine the meaning. Your attitude and actions do." Another hand went up from a staff sergeant who was facing medical retirement after a training accident. "How do you deal with feeling like your military experience doesn't translate to civilian careers? Employers seem to think veterans can only do security or law enforcement. That's a perception problem that we have to overcome through education and demonstration," I answered. "Military service teaches problem-solving, leadership, teamwork, and responsibility under pressure. Those skills are valuable in every industry, but you have to help civilian employers understand how they translate." The program continued for several hours, with discussions that covered practical aspects of transition planning as well as emotional and psychological challenges that many veterans faced. By the end of the session, I could see that several participants had gained confidence and clarity about their future prospects. As the group was dispersing, Mrs. Chen approached from the kitchen area where she'd been listening to parts of the presentation. Her smile was warm and knowing, the expression of someone who'd watched a story come full circle in ways that satisfied her sense of justice and propriety. "Captain Morgan," she said formally, though her eyes showed the affection of someone who'd known me when I was just Sarah Mitchell trying to figure out how to operate an industrial dishwasher. "It's good to see you back where you belong. Mrs. Chen, I'm not sure I ever thanked you properly for giving me a chance when I needed work and didn't have references or experience," I said, meaning every word. "You treated me with dignity when I wasn't sure I deserved it." "Everyone deserves dignity," she replied simply. "Your rank and your uniform don't change who you are as a person. I could see that from the first day you showed up here." The conversation reminded me of how much my perspective had changed during the year I'd spent hidden in civilian employment. The woman who'd resigned her commission in despair and self-doubt had learned to see value in all kinds of work and all kinds of people. The officer who'd returned to command had brought those lessons with her, creating a leadership style that honored both military excellence and human dignity. That evening, I sat in my quarters reviewing squadron personnel files and preparing for the next day's operations. But my mind kept returning to the circular journey that had brought me back to this point. Operation Nightfall had ended my first career as an Air Force pilot, sending me into hiding among people who knew nothing of my past or my credentials. Working alongside those people had taught me lessons about leadership and service that no military school had ever covered. The person who'd served hash browns and memorized meal preferences had learned to see past uniforms and job titles to recognize the humanity in everyone she encountered. The commander who'd emerged from that experience understood that effective leadership meant creating environments where people felt valued and supported, rather than managed and controlled. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection with a call from Major Santos. "Ma'am, sorry to bother you after hours, but we've received orders for a deployment that I thought you should know about immediately." "What kind of deployment, Kevin?" "Humanitarian mission to Southeast Asia. Natural disaster relief with possible medical evacuation support. 6 aircraft. Full squadron support. Duration estimated at 30 days. The mission was exactly the kind of operation that combined military capability with genuine service to civilian populations. The opportunity to use F-22s and their advanced sensor systems to save lives rather than take them. It was also the kind of complex deployment that would test everything I'd tried to build in squadron culture and readiness." "When do we deploy?" I asked, already beginning to mentally organize the preparation timeline. 72 hours, ma'am. Fast turnaround. But the situation requires immediate response." "Understood. Call squadron meeting for 0600 tomorrow. We've got work to do." As I hung up the phone and began pulling together the materials needed for deployment planning, I realized that this mission would be the ultimate test of whether my approach to leadership could handle real-world pressures and demands. The next month would determine whether treating people with dignity and building collaborative relationships could produce the kind of performance that humanitarian missions required. 3 days later, I strapped into the cockpit of an F-22 for the first time since Operation Nightfall, surrounded by pilots whose confidence in my leadership had been earned through months of consistent support and honest communication. As our formation lifted off from Elmendorf and turned south toward a mission that would test everything we'd built together, I felt a sense of completeness that had been missing since that night over hostile territory when I'd thought my career was ending. The woman who'd hidden in an Alaskan cafeteria had learned to find purpose in serving others regardless of her job title or uniform. The commander who'd emerged from that experience understood that true leadership meant empowering people to do their best work while knowing they were valued and supported. Whatever challenges waited in Southeast Asia, I was confident that my squadron was ready to meet them with the kind of professionalism and humanity that made military service meaningful. Below us, Alaska's wilderness stretched toward the horizon, vast and indifferent to human ambitions but somehow reassuring in its permanence. Above us, clear skies offered unlimited visibility for the journey ahead. And around me, the best pilots I'd ever had the privilege to command were ready to use their skills in service of people who needed help, regardless of nationality or politics or strategic significance. Sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring you back to where you started with new understanding of why you were there in the first place. My year serving meals had taught me that everyone deserves respect and dignity, regardless of their position or circumstances. My return to command had proven that leadership based on those principles could produce excellence that exceeded anything achieved through authority and intimidation alone. The radio crackled with routine communication as our formation settled into cruise flight, professional voices coordinating complex movements with the calm competence that made dangerous missions possible. In a few hours, we'd be establishing operations in a place where our skills would be used to save lives and provide hope to people facing circumstances beyond their control. It was exactly what I'd trained my entire career to do, and exactly what the person who learned to find meaning in serving hash browns would have chosen if given the chance to write her own orders. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.